Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 57 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New Jersey Devils, in which the Sharks have lost 7-2. And this was supposed to be a bit of a feel-good game for the San Jose Sharks. Not only were some of their players getting to play against their former team, like Fabian Zetterlund, Mackenzie Blackwood, and Nikita Hutyuk, but more importantly, this was also the first game for Timo Meier back in San Jose ever since being traded by the Sharks last season to this New Jersey Devils squad. There was a big moment in the first period. They played a nice little video in the arena. Tons of applause for the former player who was so good in his time in San Jose. And yet, the good feelings and the good vibes around this game were pretty quickly dashed by the end of the night as the Sharks get pummeled by the Devils with this 7-2 score. And yet, you would take a look at this scoreboard and you'd think, wow, the Sharks got completely demolished through 60 minutes. But that actually wasn't the case, interestingly enough. You go back a few days ago to the game against the Nashville Predators. That one started off pretty poorly in the first period and really badly in the second period, but in the third, the Sharks put up a good comeback effort and almost managed to make it interesting, with Nashville just barely dropping at the end 4-2. Here tonight, it was quite the opposite because the Sharks started this game off quite well. They were the better team, I would say, in the opening frame against New Jersey. While they were slightly outshot, this is pretty much entirely due to the fact that on a single Devils power play in the first period, they put up a grand total of 8 shots, which is just a massive amount in a 2-minute power play. But when it comes to the even strength play, the Sharks definitely were the better team and would score the only goal of the opening frame coming from Nico Sturm. The Sharks would have liked to get more than that, but it didn't necessarily seem like it was going to be that big of a deal because, like I said, the Sharks were playing quite well up to this point, carrying over the momentum that they had at the end of that Nashville game. And yet, it did not move into the second period at all. While the second wasn't disastrous, at the very least in terms of play, in terms of the score, it definitely got a lot worse. Not only would the game be tied at 1, but the go-ahead and insurance goal would also be scored in that middle frame to make it 3-1 New Jersey at the end of the second period. And if the second period you thought was bad, the third period was significantly worse, amounting to one of the worst periods we have seen the Sharks play in a very long time this season. Sort of similar to some of the periods we were seeing from them at the early parts when they would lose like 10-1 and 10-2 to the Canucks and Penguins respectively, as they would give up a 4-1, 5-1, 6-1, and 7-1 goal just off of terrible defensive coverage and pretty bad goaltending as well, before David Quinn would call the timeout, settle the team down, and they'd sort of get into a bit of a smoother rhythm, I guess you could say. You could also kind of combine that with the fact that perhaps the Devils let off the gas a bit, and the Sharks would end up finishing it off slightly more respectably and slightly on a higher note with a goal of their own to make it 7-2. But realistically, this was a terrible third period for San Jose with very little positives to take from it. However, as I mentioned earlier on, this doesn't necessarily mean it was a game that was full-on terrible for San Jose. They looked quite good at the start of it, but it just completely fell apart near the end. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line, once again, of Duclair, Granlund, and Zetterlund. Now, I do want to mention here, as I just said, the Sharks were actually quite good in the first period, but absolutely awful in the third period. And this was pretty much the theme here tonight for every single one of the players on the San Jose Sharks. Not a single player could you really point out a positive aspect of their game when it came to the last 20 minutes of this one here tonight. And so when it comes to evaluating the players, I'm actually going to more so focus on what they did in the early parts of this game compared to the later parts. And so if you're thinking I'm being a bit too positive about these players, do know that I recognize that at the end of the day, none of them actually had a good game because of the terrible last 30 to 40 minutes that the Sharks actually put up. But I have chosen to focus slightly more on the positive aspects because maybe the Sharks will be able to capture what they did in the first period and bring it into future games, kind of like what they did in the previous one against the Nashville Predators in the third period. So when it comes to this first line of Duclair, Granlund, and Zetterlund, honestly, still not all that great. They looked really good in that third period of the previous game, and I was hoping they'd manage to carry that into this one, but that really wasn't the case. Besides Zetterlund, who I thought did get at the very least a couple of okay offensive zone chances, there really wasn't much else doing. Granlund, in fact, was probably the most invisible player on this line, as I just didn't really notice him much at all, which is quite opposite to what we usually expect, as Granlund is frequently the driving force of this top line, setting up these great offensive chances for players like Duclair and Zetterlund, who are much more in the scoring type of category of players and less so in the playmaking and play setting type of players. But Granlund just not really doing much of anything, and maybe that was why this first line just didn't actually play all that well in the first period for San Jose. They were perhaps the third or maybe even fourth best line in that opening frame. Then we get to the second line of Zadina, Eklund, and Kunin. So finally, after Zadina had strung together multiple great games in the bottom six for the San Jose Sharks, he does get promoted up to a top six role, and it immediately pays off quite well for San Jose. In practically his first shift of the game, he comes out with a great wraparound chance that just barely manages to miss the net and stay out, which would have given the Sharks an early 1-0 lead in this game. But otherwise, Zadina was definitely the best player on this second line, I felt, getting some really good chances, and is finally starting to assert himself as the type of player that the Sharks were hoping that they got when they signed him this past offseason as a former 6th overall pick from a draft just a few years ago. Whether Zadina will be able to actually finish off this season with this type of momentum is a big question mark, and if the Sharks manage to keep him signed with the team and want to see what he can do carrying into the following season is another big question mark, but at the moment Zadina is looking quite good. When it comes to his two line mates, Kunin was definitely the weak link, I would say, of this second line, but I don't actually think he was all that bad. He actually had a couple of really nice passes in this game, so while it was mostly Zadina and Eklund doing the heavy offensive work in the offensive zone, I do think Kunin was an okay enough complement to say that he had a decent first period in this one. When it comes to William Eklund, I was quite hard on Eklund's performance in the previous game. I was not a fan of how he looked against the Nashville Predators. Here tonight, again, when we were only taking into account the early parts of this game, Eklund did look a good bit better. Not quite what I'm hoping to see from Eklund and what we had necessarily been seeing from him ever since the return from the All-Stars break / bye week, because he was really good in a few of those games, but definitely a big improvement from what we saw in the previous one against Nashville, again, if we only consider the early parts. Then we get to the third line of Sturm Barabanov and Kevin Labanc. So Labanc returns to the lineup here tonight. He replaces Giovanni Smith. In my previous review, I was talking about how the most likely or the healthy scratch candidate that I would have liked to see get kicked out in favor of Kevin Labanc was Mike Hoffman, just because Hoffman was really bad that night. Now, Hoffman does end up getting demoted to the fourth line because of this. However, I guess because of maybe some veteran aspects or the fact that the Sharks are still trying to score goals, you end up kicking Giovanni Smith out of the lineup because he's really not providing anything to the San Jose Sharks when he is playing. So it definitely does make sense, and I have zero issue with that happening. But Labanc steps in onto the third line. He takes Zadina's spot, and honestly, this third line doesn't really miss much of a beat, and they were perhaps the best line for the San Jose Sharks in the opening period, somewhat close with what the second line managed to do. They were the only one to actually score a goal in that first 20 minutes, that one coming from Nico Sturm. But Labanc in particular, I thought, actually looked pretty decent. Was he the best player on this line? I'm not entirely sure. I think that might have to go to Barabanov, who continued to show off some elite offensive talent, something that we really haven't been seeing much from him at all this season. But I would still say Labanc played relatively well, and to me, at the very least, good enough to maintain a spot in the lineup, especially since that by the end of this game, nobody looked particularly good, so it's hard to really say, well, that this guy in particular was terrible compared to anybody else. So I don't think Labanc's game obviously carried into the third period, but not any worse than anybody else, at least I would say, and so he should manage to maintain that spot in the lineup. And then when it comes to Nico Sturm, he was a goal scorer here tonight. That was quite nice to see. And as I mentioned in the previous one, he's more of the defensive force on this line compared to the offensive force, though nice to see him manage to contribute on the score sheet anyhow. And then we get to the fourth line of Carpenter, Bailey, and Hoffman. Now, interestingly enough, as I mentioned early on, none of the lines here were particularly good. In the latter parts, they were quite bad. This was the line that was likely the least bad. Now, this is more so the fact that the Sharks were so bad in that, 10 or so minute stretch in the early part of the third period, but since this is the fourth line, they don't get that many shifts to show off how bad they are. So in comparison, they look less awful because they had less time to be a liability. That could definitely have somewhat to do with it, but they are the only goal scorers in the third period for San Jose. They do end this game on a slight high note there, and so I guess there has to be some kudos given in that regard. Otherwise, in the early parts of this game, you didn't exactly notice them all that much, so not super positive, but I guess not all that terrible either. This is where we get to the defensive part of the game, and this is where things absolutely fell apart for San Jose. As I mentioned earlier, the Sharks, they get crushed here on the scoreboard 7-2 by the Devils, but unlike certain other losses this season where the Sharks have just been overwhelmed by a team that is significantly better than them, I look into the past and I look at a game like the Toronto Maple Leafs loss that the Sharks lost 7-1 to them. That was a game where Toronto was just so good and the Sharks had literally zero response to what the Maple Leafs were able to do in that game, and so it didn't even feel that bad that the Sharks actually lost 7-1. Here tonight it's slightly different. This is not to say that the Devils are a bad team, but it felt more so that the Sharks were beating themselves up than it was that the Devils were actually beating them. And this definitely starts with how the defense was actually playing, especially in the latter parts. And it also starts with the top four defensemen for San Jose. The first pairing here for Ferraro and Emberson, their major issue was the defensive zone coverage. They just couldn't really seem to find themselves in the correct position more often than not, which left Devils players very, very wide open in many situations, which allowed not only the Devils to rack up the goals, but also rack up the shots in the latter part of this game. When it comes to the second defensive pairing, while defensive positioning was an issue for them as well, more so I would say stood out in a bad way was the turnovers, in particular Henry Thrun. Now, I talked a bit at length of Henry Thrun in the previous one against Nashville. I talked about how he was at times making the incorrect decision when it came to the original first breakout pass out of his zone when under very light pressure. Here tonight, it was more so a situation where he's under more moderate pressure in his own zone, having to make a slightly quicker choice, and it felt as though he was making the incorrect choice, or even just fanning on his pass more often than not in the defensive zone, which was really bad. It looked more akin to some of the games we saw from Henry Thrun when he was originally called up in the earlier parts of this season, compared to what we were seeing from Henry Thrun, let's say, prior to the All-Star break and prior to his injury that removed him for a few games. So hopefully Thrun can get back to that part, because this performance here tonight definitely was not it. And his defensive partner, Jan Ruda, really not all that much better. Besides Ruda making a good defensive play on Jesper Bratt to save a goal, that was literally one thing. It was otherwise a pretty awful night for Jan Ruda and generally for the top four defense for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the bottom pairing here, technically slightly better than what it was in the previous one, more so because Kalen Addison steps out of the lineup and Nikita Okhotyuk steps into the lineup, and it's hard to be as bad as Kalen Addison, but Okhotyuk still didn't really have all that good of a game. Burrows, similar, not all that great. It's technically a situation where because the top four defense were so bad, it's, the third defensive pairing looks slightly better just by comparison, but still, it's hard to really credit any defenseman on this team for the performance here tonight because it was quite poor in the last 40 minutes. And then we get to the goaltending where we have both Blackwood and Kähkönen making appearances here tonight. And by just looking at the score, the Sharks losing 7-2, you might think that this is a situation where Blackwood lets in like 3 or 4 goals, gets pulled, and then Kähkönen comes in and lets in the rest. But that actually wasn't the case. Blackwood gets the start against his former team, plays a few minutes in the first period, but then leaves the game with a mysterious injury and does not return for the rest of it, causing Kähkönen to have to come in and play the rest of this game. And Kähkönen was not good. I don't know if he was not mentally prepared to play here tonight against the New Jersey Devils, but he was letting in a lot of pretty bad goals. You take a look in particular the middle goals that the Devils scored here tonight. The 3 from defensemen Ball, Miller, and Smith. All 3 of these goals are just random shots from the point, or at least pretty close to the point. Saves that Kähkönen should likely be able to make. At least like 2 of the 3 goals could have easily been saved by Kähkönen, but he just didn't seem particularly engaged, kind of like the rest of the team didn't seem particularly engaged in the last 2 periods of this one. So just not a very good game for the goaltending, not a very good game for the defense, not a very good game in general if you look past just the first 20 minutes. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will be taking on the Anaheim Ducks. Technically a division rival, though that rivalry hasn't really been active for the last few years just because both of these teams have been quite bad. However, there is still some interest in watching this game. With the Sharks losing here tonight and losing more recently, and the Chicago Blackhawks actually picking up a couple of points recently, the Sharks have brought themselves back into a tie for the last place spot in the league. It is Blackhawks who currently hold it just due to having a couple of games in hand, but the Sharks, who are going to be looking at keeping this just a two-man race, would look to shut the door on any other team trying to invade in this situation. One of those teams could easily be the Anaheim Ducks, who are relatively close to the bottom of the standings, so realistically, it is in the Sharks' best interest to lose this upcoming game as well. Class dismissed.